Last night I had a dream that felt more real than reality itself. It started with my death. I remember the feeling as vividly as if it had truly happened. In my dream, I was thrust into a reality I couldn't escape, a courtroom cloaked in shadows, its walls high and menacing. Torches flickered weakly, their flames struggling against the oppressive darkness that filled the room. The air was thick, suffocating, and carried the weight of judgment. I stood at the center, shackled and trembling, surrounded by faceless figures cloaked in heavy black robes. Their presence was overwhelming, as though they weren't mere humans but something far more sinister. They spoke in harsh, condemning voices, yet their words were indistinct, like whispers carried on a malevolent wind. Each sound felt like a dagger to my chest, sharp and unforgiving. My name echoed in the chamber, followed by accusations that made no sense. They accused me of a crime, though I couldn't understand what it was. No details, no specifics, just an unrelenting declaration of my guilt. "Do you deny it?" one of them asked, their voice void of humanity, as if spoken by the void itself. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My throat felt as though it had been sewn shut. Panic set in, my heart pounding against my ribcage like a prisoner desperate to escape. I shook my head frantically, tears streaming down my face, but my silence seemed to anger them. "She refuses to confess," another voice said, colder than the first. The crowd murmured in agreement. Their faceless heads turned toward me, their collective gaze a force that crushed my spirit. It was in that moment I realized they weren't interested in the truth. My innocence didn't matter. The dream didn't allow me the comfort of waking up. Instead, it pushed me further into its twisted narrative. They sentenced me death by punishment so cruel, it seemed to have been designed to break not just my body, but my very soul. I wanted to scream, to plead, to fight back, but it was useless. They dragged me out of the courtroom, and I was powerless to resist. The scene shifted, yet the fear remained. I found myself in a dark, stone chamber, the sound of dripping water echoing through the cold air. Chains rattled as I was bound to a table. I could feel the rough surface of the stone against my skin, every detail of the dream magnified to an unbearable intensity. My wrists and ankles ached as iron cuffs bit into my flesh. I looked around, desperate for some sign of mercy, but all I saw were the shadowy figures looming above me. One of them stepped forward, carrying an instrument that glinted faintly in the dim light. I couldn't see what it was, but the shape was enough to send a chill down my spine. And then it began. Pain. Blinding, searing pain. It ripped through my body like fire, consuming every nerve, every thought. I screamed a sound so raw and primal it startled even me, but my screams didn't move them. If anything, they seemed to relish it. Their laughter filled the chamber, cold and unfeeling. I begged for it to stop. "Please. I don't understand. I didn't do anything." My words fell on deaf ears. They continued their work, their movements methodical, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. I lost track of time. Minutes, hours, days, it felt like an eternity of suffering. Finally, the end came. I could feel my life slipping away, my body growing colder with every passing second. They unshackled me, my limp form falling to the floor. I lay there bleeding, broken, unable to move. My vision blurred, but I could make out the faint shapes of the figures as they left, their work complete. I thought that was it, that I would fade into the void, and this nightmare would finally end. But the dream had other plans. My body was dragged, though I couldn't see by whom or what. The sensation of being pulled over cold, uneven stone was all I could register. When we stopped, I was dropped unceremoniously, my body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. I tried to breathe, but the air was damp and foul, filled with the stench of decay. I opened my eyes, or at least I think I did, and found myself in a dungeon. The walls were jagged stone, slick with moisture. The floor was littered with debris, bones, scraps of rotting cloth, and puddles of something I didn't want to identify. My own blood pooled around me, warm against the cold ground. And then the worst part began. I could feel it, my body starting to decay. The dream didn't spare me the details. I felt my flesh peel away, strips falling off as worms and other creatures feasted on me. The sensation was unbearable, a grotesque mix of pain and numbness. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was trapped in my own body, forced to experience every horrifying moment. It was then, in that dark, rotting pit, that I thought, this must be the end. This has to be the end. But I was wrong. As I lay there, consumed by agony, the shadows around me began to move. They twisted and writhed, taking on forms that defied explanation. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, their shapes flickering between human and something far more terrifying. I tried to focus on them, but their presence was overwhelming, as if they were pressing down on my very soul. They spoke, their voices calm yet piercing, echoing through my mind. "We don't want your death," they said. "We want a deal." I was dragged from the dungeon into the open, though the air outside brought no relief. It was cold and heavy, tinged with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid burn of smoke. My body, already battered and broken, felt like dead weight as they pulled me toward the center of the town square. The chains around my wrists and ankles dug deeper into my flesh with every jolt, every cruel tug. I could feel the rawness, the skin scraped and torn, blood trickling down in thin streams. The square itself was a grotesque stage, filled with eager spectators who hungered for a spectacle. They gathered in masses, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of torches mounted on tall iron poles. Their eyes, so many eyes, glared at me with malice, with glee, with an unholy thirst for suffering. I could hear their laughter, sharp and mocking, cutting through the cold night air like a blade. "She deserves it," one voice sneered. "A punishment long overdue," another chimed in, followed by a chorus of agreement. I didn't recognize them. These weren't people I knew or had wronged, at least not that I could remember. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I wasn't a person to them. I was a spectacle, an object for their twisted entertainment. In the center of the square stood the instrument of my execution, a massive wooden structure, its beams darkened and splintered with age. Shackles and ropes hung from its arms, still stained with the remnants of those who came before me. Beneath it was a pile of ashes and charred bones, an unspoken reminder of what awaited me. I was shoved forward, my knees buckling under the force. My captors showed no mercy, hauling me upright with brutal efficiency. The chains clinked ominously as they secured my wrists and ankles to the wooden frame. The iron cuffs bit into my skin, grinding against raw wounds and bruises. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through my body, but I gritted my teeth, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing me cry out. But my silence didn't deter them. A hooded figure stepped forward, carrying a long, jagged blade. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool of suffering, designed to prolong pain rather than end it quickly. He held it up for the crowd to see, and they roared in approval, their cheers reverberating through the square like a wicked symphony. My heart pounded against my chest, a wild, desperate rhythm that matched the chaos around me. I wanted to scream, to plead, to beg for mercy, but my voice was caught in my throat. What would be the point? Mercy didn't exist here. The blade came down, not to kill, but to maim. The first cut was shallow, a cruel tease that sent a sharp jolt of pain through my arm. I clenched my fists, the chains rattling as my body instinctively jerked against its restraints. The second cut was deeper, dragging slowly across my flesh as if savoring the agony it caused. The crowd cheered louder. Louder, someone shouted, "Make her scream." And I did. The pain was too much to bear. My cries echoed through the square, raw and guttural, but instead of sympathy, they were met with laughter. To them, my suffering was a source of entertainment. They didn't stop with the blade. They brought out other tools, whips, branding irons, instruments I couldn't even name. Each one inflicted a new kind of pain, each one designed to break me piece by piece. The heat of the branding iron seared into my skin, the smell of burning flesh filling my nostrils. The whip tore through my back, the sharp crack followed by a searing sting that made my entire body convulse. And all the while they laughed. My vision blurred with tears, but through the haze, I could see the hooded figures orchestrating the torture. They moved with purpose, their actions precise and practiced, as though this was a ritual they had performed countless times. Their faces remained hidden, but I could feel their satisfaction, their cold indifference to my pain. Time lost meaning. I couldn't tell if minutes had passed or hours. My body was a canvas of agony, every nerve screaming in protest. I was so close to the edge, teetering on the brink of unconsciousness, when they decided it was time for the final act. The hooded figures stepped back, their work done. The crowd grew silent, an eerie stillness falling over the square. One of them raised their hand, and I felt the frame I was bound to begin to tilt backward. My head lulled as the world shifted, and I realized I was being lowered into a pit. It was shallow, just deep enough to hold a body. The bottom was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of decay. They unshackled me, letting my broken body fall into the pit with a sickening thud. I couldn't move. Every part of me screamed in protest as I lay there staring up at the night sky. The last thing I saw before darkness consumed me was the crowd, their faces alight with cruel satisfaction, and the hooded figures turning their backs as if I no longer mattered. Then, the earth began to cover me. They were burying me alive. As the first handfuls of dirt hit my face, I felt a strange sense of relief. This was it. This was the end. The pain would stop, and I could finally escape this nightmare. But as the darkness closed in, I realized the truth. They didn't just want my death. They wanted my pain, and even in death, they wouldn't let me go. I thought it was over, but my suffering was only beginning. When I woke, I wasn't greeted by the release of death or the ethereal calm of an afterlife. Instead, I found myself surrounded by suffocating darkness, a darkness so absolute it felt alive. At first, I couldn't comprehend where I was. My senses were sluggish, my thoughts fragmented. Pain was the only thing grounding me, sharp and persistent, coursing through every inch of my broken body. The air was damp and cold, clinging to my skin like a heavy shroud. It smelled of decay, a putrid, nauseating stench that filled my lungs with every shallow breath. The stone floor beneath me was slick, either with moisture or something far worse. My body felt impossibly heavy, each limb a leaden weight that refused to respond. I tried to move, to lift myself off the floor, but agony shot through me like lightning. My ribs protested, sending a jolt of pain that left me gasping. My hands instinctively clawed at the ground, the rough texture of the stone scraping against my fingers. But no matter how much I struggled, I couldn't summon the strength to rise. Then came the realization, the horrifying, undeniable truth. I wasn't free. I wasn't dead. I was trapped. The silence around me was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the void. The sound seemed to stretch endlessly, bouncing off unseen walls and emphasizing just how vast and empty this place was. Or was it vast? I couldn't tell. The darkness was so thick it felt as though I were entombed in a coffin, buried alive in some cruel, endless pit. And then I felt it, the wet, sticky warmth pooling beneath me. My own blood, still fresh, still flowing from the countless wounds inflicted during my execution. It seeped into the cracks of the stone, spreading outward in thin rivulets. I could smell it, metallic and sharp, mixing with the stench of rot. I tried to speak, to call out for help, but my throat was raw and useless. Every word reduced to a hoarse whisper that was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Panic began to set in, a cold, relentless wave that tightened my chest and quickened my breathing. My heart pounded furiously, a wild, frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the silence. And then came the worst part, the sensation of my body beginning to change. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A strange itching beneath my skin, a crawling discomfort that spread from my fingertips to my toes. I dismissed it as a product of my injuries, a trick of my fragmented mind. But it grew worse, much worse. The itching turned into a burning, a fiery sensation that made me claw at my arms and legs in desperation. And then I felt it. My skin, my flesh, it was peeling away. Tiny strips at first, no bigger than the edge of a fingernail, but then larger pieces began to fall. I could feel it happening, every agonizing moment of my body unraveling. The wet slap of flesh hitting the ground echoed around me, the sound more horrifying than anything I had ever heard. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for this nightmare to end, but my voice was gone, my throat too raw and torn from the execution. I was left with nothing but the sound of my own body decomposing, a grotesque symphony of wet, squelching noises that made my stomach churn. The worms came next. I don't know how long I lay there before I felt them. At first it was just a faint tickle, the sensation so light it almost went unnoticed. But then the tickling turned into movement, writhing, burrowing movement. I could feel them crawling through my wounds, slipping beneath my skin, feasting on what little remained of my flesh. I wanted to rip them off, to claw at them until they were gone, but my body refused to obey. My hands lay limp at my sides, useless and unresponsive. I was forced to endure it, every horrifying second of their invasion. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in that grotesque limbo. Minutes? Hours? Days? Time had no meaning in this place. There was only the darkness, the pain, and the slow, horrifying decay of my own body. And yet, through it all, I remained conscious. That was perhaps the cruelest part of it all, the fact that I couldn't escape. I couldn't pass out, couldn't lose myself to the void. I was forced to feel everything, to experience every agonizing moment of my suffering. Eventually, I began to notice other sounds in the darkness. Soft, shuffling movements, like something dragging itself across the stone floor. Breathing deep, guttural, and inhuman. At first, I thought I was imagining it, my mind conjuring phantoms in its desperation for company. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct, until I could no longer dismiss them as hallucinations. Something was there with me.
I tried to look around, but the darkness was impenetrable. I could feel its presence, though a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me from all sides. It moved closer, its breathing growing louder, each exhale rattling with an unnatural wetness. And then it stopped. I could feel it hovering over me, its presence looming like a shadow. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was watching me, studying me. For the first time since waking in this place, I felt something other than pain. I felt terror. Whatever it was, it didn't touch me. It didn't speak. It simply lingered, its presence a constant reminder of just how helpless I was. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving me alone once more. I don't know how long I stayed there, trapped in the darkness, my mind unraveling with each passing moment. All I knew was that this wasn't the end, my suffering wasn't over, it had only just begun. We don't want your death. We want a deal. As I lay there, consumed by pain, fear, and the grotesque realization of my decaying body, the silence in the dungeon suddenly shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a faint hum that seemed to resonate deep within my chest. The sound grew louder, an eerie, vibrating frequency that filled the air and drowned out the dripping water and distant echoes. It was as though the very fabric of reality around me was being twisted, stretched, and distorted. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. I felt something change, a presence creeping into the dungeon, unseen but undeniable. It wasn't just one presence, but three, distinct yet unified, each carrying an energy that sent shivers through my shattered body. Then, out of the darkness, they emerged. At first, I couldn't discern their forms. They seemed to shift and flicker, as if they couldn't decide what shape to take. Shadows bled into each other, twisting and swirling like smoke caught in an invisible wind. Slowly, they began to solidify, taking on vague humanoid shapes cloaked in an aura of menace. But even as they appeared human, I could sense that they were anything but. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were veiled in shadows, their features indistinct and ever-changing, and yet their eyes burned through the darkness like twin suns, piercing and unrelenting. Each figure had its own color, one a deep, smoldering red, another a sickly, venomous green, and the third a shimmering gold that glinted with a deceptive warmth. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Their presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as though the dungeon itself was bowing to their power. My mind felt exposed, vulnerable, as if their gaze could strip away every layer of my being and lay bare the very essence of my soul. And then they spoke. "We don't want your death," said the first, its voice calm yet dripping with an unearthly weight. The words echoed in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. "We want a deal." The second figure stepped closer, its green-tinged presence radiating a sense of danger. "You're suffering, it amuses us," it said, the tone sharp and serpentine, each syllable cutting through me like a blade. "But there is more we can offer you: power, purpose, life." The third figure, the one with the golden eyes, tilted its head as though studying me. "In exchange, you will serve us. A simple task for a reward beyond your imagining." Its voice was smooth, almost soothing, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of deceit. I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but my throat was dry, and my voice came out as nothing more than a rasp. They didn't seem to need my words, though. They answered the question before I could even form it in my mind. "There are 3 relics," the red-eyed figure explained, its voice reverberating through the dungeon. "Each one hidden in a place where only the brave or the foolish dare to tread. Retrieve them for us, and we will grant you your life back." "The relics are not ordinary," the green-eyed figure added, its tone dripping with sinister delight. "They are fragments of power, scattered and protected. To claim them is to face death again and again." "But should you succeed," the golden-eyed figure interjected, its voice almost hypnotic, "you will be reborn. Not as the broken creature you are now, but as something greater, something eternal." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and peril. I wanted to scream at them, to demand answers. Why me? Why this? But I couldn't. The only thing I could do was listen as they continued to weave their sinister offer. "There is a cost," the red-eyed figure said, stepping closer. I could feel its heat, like standing too close to a roaring fire. "You will bear our marks, a symbol of the pact you make. They will bind you to us, a reminder of the power we give, and the price of betrayal." The green-eyed figure's voice slithered through my mind. "The marks are not just symbols. They are anchors. They will make you stronger, faster, more cunning, but they will also remind you that you are ours. And when the relics are in our possession," the golden-eyed figure concluded, "you will be free, free to live, free to wield the power we have given you, free to walk among us as an equal. Equal. The word echoed in my mind. It sounded too good to be true. And deep down, I knew it was. There was nothing equal about this offer. They were beings of unimaginable power, and I was nothing more than a tool, a pawn in their game. But what choice did I have? To refuse meant staying here, rotting in the dark, my body and mind consumed by decay. To accept meant facing horrors I couldn't yet fathom, but it also meant a chance, a sliver of hope, no matter how dangerous. You hesitate, the red-eyed figure said, its tone edged with impatience. Do you value your pride over your life? Or perhaps you fear what you might become, the green-eyed figure sneered, its voice mocking. The golden-eyed figure leaned closer, its presence almost gentle. We can give you what you seek. Life. Power. Freedom. All we ask is your loyalty. I closed my eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. My mind raced, weighing the impossible choices. And then, slowly, I nodded. I accept, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figures stepped back and I felt the air shift again. A low hum began to vibrate through the dungeon, growing louder and louder until it was a deafening roar. The shadows around me seemed to come alive, swirling and twisting into dark, arcane symbols that burned themselves into my skin. The pain was unbearable, like fire coursing through my veins. I screamed, my body convulsing as the marks etched themselves into me, deep black patterns interlaced with crimson red. They pulsed with an unholy energy, a constant reminder of the pact I had made. As the ritual ended, the figures spoke one last time, their voices echoing in unison. You belong to us now. Do not fail. The relics await. And just like that, they were gone, leaving me alone in the darkness, once more marked, changed, and bound to a destiny I couldn't escape. My suffering had brought me to this moment, but I knew it was only the beginning. What lay ahead would test me in ways I couldn't imagine. The dungeon was silent again, but this time I didn't feel entirely alone. The marks on my body throbbed, a constant reminder of the pact I had made. The deal was sealed. And my journey had begun. The marks burned into my skin, a cruel reminder of what I'd agreed to. The moment I uttered the words, I accept, everything changed. The air in the dungeon became suffocatingly thick, as if the darkness itself had come alive, wrapping its tendrils around me. The three figures stepped closer, their forms towering over me, shadows rippling like liquid nightmares. Without a word, they began the ritual. The first figure, with its burning red eyes, raised his hand. In its palm, a flame ignited, not a natural flame, but something otherworldly, black as midnight, with flickers of crimson that danced like living entities. The flame didn't cast light. Instead, it seemed to devour it, pulling the remaining fragments of illumination out of the room.
The second figure, its venomous green eyes glinting with malice, produced something from the folds of its shadowy form, a dagger, long and curved, with a blade that seemed to hum with an unearthly vibration. The metal was etched with intricate runes, pulsating faintly as if alive. The figure gripped it tightly, its presence radiating danger. The third figure, golden-eyed and deceptively calm, began to chant in a language I couldn't understand. The words were guttural, harsh, yet hauntingly melodic, as though they belonged to a time before humanity had words for good or evil. Each syllable carried a weight that seemed to pierce through my mind, resonating deep within my soul. I tried to move, to pull away from the overwhelming presence of these beings, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, held in place by an invisible force that pressed down on me like iron chains. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "You have chosen," the red-eyed figure intoned, its voice booming through the chamber. "Now you will bear the mark of your choice." The green-eyed figure stepped forward, the dagger gleaming ominously in its hand. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. With deliberate slowness, it lowered the blade to my chest. The first cut was shallow but precise. The cold metal pierced my skin, and the pain was immediate, sharp and searing. Blood welled up, dark and glistening, trickling down my body in thin rivulets. The second cut followed, then the third. each one forming part of a pattern I couldn't see but could feel lines and curves etched into my flesh with methodical precision. As the blade worked, the red-eyed figure began to speak, its voice merging with the golden-eyed figure's chant. The words were incomprehensible, ancient and arcane, but their meaning was clear. They weren't just carving into my body, they were carving into my very being, branding me with their power. The pain intensified, but it was no longer just physical. It felt as though something was burrowing into my soul, unearthing parts of me I didn't know existed. Memories flashed before my eyes, fragments of my life, moments I had forgotten or buried. Joy, sorrow, regret, fear, all of it was laid bare, exposed and vulnerable. And then the marks began to burn. It was as if molten fire had been poured onto my skin, seeping into the fresh wounds and spreading through my veins. The heat was unbearable, consuming me from the inside out. I screamed, the sound raw and primal, echoing off the stone walls of the dungeon. But even as the pain reached its peak, I felt something else, something alien and powerful stirring within me. The marks weren't just burns or scars. They were alive. The patterns carved into my skin began to shift, moving and writhing as if they had a will of their own. They glowed faintly, alternating between deep black and crimson red, pulsating like a second heartbeat. I could feel them, feel the power coursing through them, anchoring themselves to me. With every pulse, I felt myself changing. The first wave of power hit me like a tidal force. My senses sharpened. I could hear the faintest drip of water in the farthest corners of the dungeon, smell the damp, decaying stone with terrifying clarity. My vision, once clouded by darkness, now pierced through the shadows. I could see the faint outlines of the figures more clearly, their forms more monstrous and alien than I had first realized. The second wave was subtler but no less profound. A new awareness took root in my mind, a sense of cunning, of calculation. Thoughts and strategies began to form with startling clarity, as if I were no longer constrained by the limits of human instinct. The final wave was the most unsettling. My body, broken and weak, began to mend itself. I could feel my wounds knitting together, the pain receding as new strength flooded my limbs. But it wasn't a comforting sensation. It was invasive, unnatural, like my very essence was being rewritten. "You are no longer who you were," the golden-eyed figure said, its voice cutting through the haze. "The marks have claimed you. You belong to us now." I looked down at my body, trembling and covered in the glowing patterns. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, twisted, intricate, and almost beautiful in their grotesqueness. They weren't just symbols, they were alive, a part of me, and yet something entirely separate. What have you done to me?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have given you the tools to succeed," the green-eyed figure hissed, its tone dripping with malice. "Strength, resilience, cunning. The power of the spider, the fox, and the serpent now flows through your veins. But with power comes responsibility," the red-eyed figure added, its voice heavy with warning. "Fail us, and the marks will consume you." The golden-eyed figure stepped closer, its presence almost comforting. "The path ahead will not be easy. The relics will test you. The world will resist you. But remember this, the marks are not just a burden. They are a gift." As their words sank in, the three figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The oppressive air lifted, leaving me alone once more in the silent dungeon. But I was no longer the same. The marks still burned, a constant reminder of the pact I had made. They whispered to me in a language I couldn't understand, urging me forward, pushing me toward the destiny I had reluctantly accepted. I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing, my body trembling. I didn't know what lay ahead or whether I had made the right choice. All I knew was that there was no turning back. The blood pact was sealed, and my journey had begun. Whatever awaited me, I would face it not as the person I once was, but as something else entirely. The first test awaited me retrieve the relic from the cathedral. When I emerged from the dungeon, the world outside was unrecognizable. It wasn't just the darkness of the dungeon that had left me disoriented. The very air seemed different, as if it carried the weight of something ancient and broken. The landscape stretched before me, barren and bleak, a testament to the decay that had consumed this place. The ground was cracked and dry, riddled with deep fissures that seemed to groan under the strain of holding the earth together. Dust swirled in the faint, stagnant breeze, carrying the bitter scent of ash and rot. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, heavy with clouds that churned like a cauldron of smoke. There was no sun, no stars, no source of light, only an oppressive gloom that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I walked, I noticed the remnants of what must have once been a town. The skeletal remains of houses and buildings dotted the landscape, their structures leaning and crumbling as if bowing to the inevitable march of time. Windows were shattered, doors hung crookedly on rusted hinges, and walls were blackened with soot and fire damage. The streets were no better. They were littered with debris, broken furniture, shards of glass, and most disturbingly, the remnants of life that had once thrived here. Clothing lay in tattered heaps, as if their owners had vanished into thin air, and bones protruded from the earth in macabre displays, some still clutching the tools or weapons they'd once held in their final moments. The silence was deafening. There were no birds, no insects, no signs of life at all. The only sound was the crunch of my footsteps against the brittle ground, each one echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. And yet, I didn't feel alone. The marks on my skin pulsed faintly, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to resonate with the environment around me. It was as if the very land itself was alive, aware of my presence, watching my every move. Occasionally I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, a shadow darting behind a crumbling wall, a flicker of something humanoid in a shattered window. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. The air grew heavier the closer I got to my destination. It wasn't just the physical weight of the atmosphere, it was something deeper, more insidious. It pressed down on my chest, making it harder to breathe, filling my lungs with the scent of decay and despair. My steps grew slower, each one an effort against the invisible force that seemed determined to keep me from moving forward. And then I saw it. The cathedral loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette cutting through the oppressive sky like a jagged scar. It was massive, far larger than I had imagined, its spires reaching impossibly high into the heavens. The structure was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, yet it exuded a sinister energy that made my skin crawl. The walls were blackened, not by fire but by something more ancient, more malevolent. Gargoyles adorned every ledge and corner, their grotesque faces frozen in eternal snarls. Some appeared to watch me, their stone eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. I could feel their judgment, their disdain, as though they knew the weight of my sins. The cathedral's doors were massive, towering slabs of wood reinforced with iron bands. They were intricately carved with scenes of suffering and torment, figures writhing in agony, faces contorted in despair. and hands reaching upward as if begging for salvation that would never come. Above the doors, an inscription in a language I couldn't read was etched into the stone, glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. Surrounding the cathedral was what remained of the town's heart. The houses here were even more decrepit than those I had passed earlier, their walls buckling inward, their roofs caved in. The streets were stained with dark streaks that I realized with a sinking feeling were dried blood. Bones littered the ground here too, some arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, as though marking the site of some dark ritual. But it wasn't the town or the cathedral that filled me with the most dread, it was the people, or what was left of them. At first I thought they were statues scattered throughout the square in front of the cathedral. They stood motionless, their heads bowed, their bodies draped in tattered robes. But as I approached, I realized they weren't statues at all. They were monks or something like monks still alive, yet lifeless in every way that mattered. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes sunken and empty, as though their souls had long since been drained from their bodies. They moved slowly, mechanically, shuffling between tasks that seemed pointless and repetitive, sweeping the same patch of ground, lighting and relighting candles, carrying stacks of rotting books from one place to another. I stayed in the shadows, careful not to draw their attention. I didn't know what they would do if they saw me, but I knew it wouldn't be good. My heart pounded in my chest as I slipped past them, my breath shallow and quiet. The marks on my skin burned faintly, as though they were urging me onward, guiding me toward my goal. But with every step I took, the air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and the oppressive energy of the cathedral more suffocating. I paused at the base of the structure, craning my neck to look up at its towering spires. The relic was inside. I could feel its presence like a faint hum vibrating through the air. But getting to it would be no easy task. The monks patrolled the perimeter, and the cathedral itself was a fortress of dark stone and jagged edges. This was only the beginning. The first test awaited me, and I couldn't afford to fail. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the shadow of the cathedral, the weight of my pack heavy on my shoulders. Whatever lay inside, I would face it not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The relic was waiting, and so was my fate. The closer I came to the cathedral, the more palpable the dread became. It wasn't just the imposing structure or the grotesque gargoyles leering down from the heights, it was the monks. They moved like ghosts, silent and methodical, weaving through the crumbling remnants of the courtyard. Each step they took was deliberate, their heads bowed in submission to some unseen force. From a shadowed corner, I crouched low behind the skeletal remains of what might have once been a market stall. It offered little protection, but it was enough to observe them without drawing attention to myself. My breath came shallow and quiet, and I tried to ignore the faint burn of the marks on my skin, a constant reminder of the pack that had brought me here. There were dozens of them, maybe more. They wore tattered robes that dragged along the ground, the fabric so stained and torn it was impossible to tell what color it had once been. Their movements were mechanical, almost inhuman, as though their bodies were being controlled by invisible strings. Each monk carried out a task, sweeping the same patch of ground, lighting candles, shuffling books from one dilapidated pile to another. But there was no purpose behind their actions. It was as if they were trapped in an eternal loop, forced to repeat these meaningless routines forever. Their faces were the worst. Each one was pale and gaunt, their skin stretched tightly over bones that jutted out like jagged rocks. Their eyes, if they could still be called that, were sunken hollows, devoid of life or emotion. There was no recognition, no spark of humanity, only emptiness, as though their souls had been torn from them long ago. Their mouths hung slightly open, their cracked lips moving silently as though muttering prayers to a god that had abandoned them. Occasionally, one would stop and turn, their head tilting unnaturally as if listening for something. In those moments, my heart froze. Their gaze, though vacant, seemed to pierce through the darkness, as though they could sense every vibration, every whisper of movement. I didn't dare breathe until they returned to their monotonous tasks. I realized quickly that they weren't human anymore, not entirely. They were something else, something darker. The air around them shimmered faintly, as if distorted by heat, and the faintest trace of a foul, sulfuric smell seemed to follow wherever they went. I wondered if they were bound to the cathedral, cursed to guard it for eternity, or if they had willingly sacrificed their humanity in service to the power that dwelled within its walls. Either way, they were dangerous. The marks on my skin pulsed faintly, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to sync with my racing heartbeat. They weren't just a brand of ownership, they were something more, something alive. They whispered to me, urging me forward, but also warning me to tread carefully. I could almost feel their energy connecting with the monks, as though sensing the same dark force that animated them. I scanned the courtyard, my mind racing as I tried to devise a plan. The monks moved in patterns, their paths crisscrossing like a slow, deliberate dance. It was almost hypnotic, watching them drift from one task to the next. But I knew that one wrong move would draw their attention, and I couldn't afford that. If they saw me, if they caught me, I knew what would happen. I had already seen the bloodstains on the stones, the shattered remains of those who had tried and failed before me. I didn't know what they had done to deserve their fate, but it was clear that the monks had no tolerance for intruders. The thought of those lifeless eyes turning toward me, of those skeletal hands grabbing hold, was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I needed to move, but the question was how. The main doors of the cathedral were heavily guarded, with at least a dozen monks stationed nearby. Their movements were slower there, more deliberate, as if the very act of guarding the entrance demanded their complete attention. But the doors themselves looked ancient and heavy, reinforced with iron bands that glinted faintly in the dim light. Even if I managed to reach them, I doubted I could open them without alerting the entire courtyard. That left the side entrances, or what remained of them. The cathedral's walls were riddled with cracks and gaps, some large enough for a person to slip through. The problem was that these openings were scattered, and each one seemed to lie directly in the path of the monks' patrols. I would have to time it perfectly, slipping through the gaps in their patterns without making a sound. I studied their movements, forcing myself to focus despite the rising panic in my chest. There was a rhythm to their steps, a mechanical precision that hinted at some unseen order. Every few minutes they would shift positions, leaving brief windows of opportunity where the paths were clear. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The first gap came quickly. A pair of monks shuffled past, their robes brushing the ground with a soft, whispering sound. I waited until their backs were turned, then darted from my hiding spot to a pile of rubble nearby. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, but they didn't turn. I crouched low, pressing myself against the cold stone as I waited for the next opening. My breaths came in shallow gasps, each one carefully controlled to avoid drawing attention. The marks on my skin burned hotter now, as though feeding off my fear, but I couldn't afford to stop. Another gap, another dash. Each movement brought me closer to the cathedral, but the closer I got, the heavier the air became. It was as if the structure itself was alive, its dark energy radiating outward in waves that threatened to crush me. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground and into my body. The monks were everywhere now, their movements growing faster, more erratic. It was as though they could sense my presence, even if they hadn't seen me yet. Their hollow eyes scanned the shadows, their heads jerking unnaturally as they searched for someone. I reached the base of the cathedral's wall, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough stone. One of the cracks was just ahead, wide enough to slip through if I could time it right. But the monks were closing in, their paths converging in a way that left little room for error. I waited, counting the seconds as they passed. 1, 2, 3 now. I slipped through the gap, the stone scraping against my arms and legs as I pulled myself into the darkness beyond. My body trembled with adrenaline, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, but I had made it. Inside the cathedral, the air was colder, heavier, and filled with the faint echoes of the monks' movements outside. The marks on my skin pulsed faintly, their whispers urging me deeper into the darkness. The first test had only just begun, and I knew the true danger was still ahead. For now, I was safe, but the cathedral was watching. The cathedral loomed above me, its jagged spires disappearing into the stormy gray sky. Standing at the base of its wall, I craned my neck to take in the impossibly tall structure. The faint glow of the relic pulsed at the peak of the central dome, like a heartbeat, its golden light barely piercing the suffocating gloom. I knew I couldn't enter through the front doors, not with the soulless monks patrolling outside and the labyrinth of shadows awaiting inside. My only option was the walls. I hesitated, my hands brushing against the cold, damp stone. The surface was rough and uneven, crumbling in places where time and neglect had worn it down. Climbing this behemoth would be a test of will, of strength, and of focus. One misstep, one slip, and I would fall into the courtyard below, where the monks would be waiting to finish what the dungeon had started. The marks on my skin burned faintly, as if urging me onward, their whispers a mixture of encouragement and warning. The pact I had made bound me to this task. I couldn't fail. I wouldn't fail. Taking a deep breath, I pressed my hands against the wall and began my ascent. The first few feet were deceptively easy. My fingers found cracks and edges to grip, my boots scraping against protruding stones for support. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of moss and decay. As I climbed higher, the weight of the cathedral seemed to press down on me, an invisible force that made every movement feel like a battle. The higher I went, the worse it became. The air grew colder, biting at my exposed skin. The wind, faint at first, began to pick up, howling like a mournful spirit as it whipped around the spires. It carried with it the faint echoes of distant whispers, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the cathedral itself. I tried to block them out, focusing on the climb, but they burrowed into my mind, making my head pound with their unrelenting presence. The stone beneath my fingers was slick with moisture, and each step upward required more effort than the last. My muscles ached, my arms and legs trembling as I fought to maintain my grip. I could feel my breath quickening, my chest heaving as I struggled against the growing fatigue. And then, the first stone gave way. I reached for a handhold, a jagged piece of stone that jutted out from the wall, only to feel it crumble beneath my fingers. For a heart-stopping moment, I lost my balance, my body lurching backward as gravity threatened to pull me down. My free hand flailed, desperately searching for anything to grab onto. At the last second, I found another crack in the wall, my fingers digging into it with a force that sent pain shooting up my arm. My body slammed against the stone, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I hung there for a moment, my heart pounding in my ears, the world spinning around me. The relic's faint glow above seemed impossibly far away, a reminder of how much farther I still had to climb. Pushing through the pain, I forced myself to keep going. Every movement was deliberate, every grip tested before I trusted it. The silence around me was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint scrape of stone against stone as I climbed. The higher I went, the more the cathedral seemed to resist me. The wind grew stronger, battering against me with relentless force. It pulled at my clothes, threatening to tear me from the wall and send me plummeting into the void below. The whispers grew louder, their tones harsher, more urgent. They weren't just background noise anymore, they were voices, speaking in that same arcane language I had heard during the blood pact. "You are not worthy," they seemed to say. "Turn back. This is not your place." I shook my head, gritting my teeth as I pushed forward. "Shut up," I muttered under my breath, though I knew they weren't listening. "I'm not turning back." Halfway up, I made the mistake of looking down. The ground below was a patchwork of shadows and death, the courtyard a distant, blurred landscape of decay. The monks were still moving, their lifeless forms shuffling like clockwork automatons. From this height they looked small, insignificant, but I knew that if I fell, they would swarm me like vultures. I tore my gaze away, focusing instead on the wall in front of me. But the momentary glance had shaken my confidence. My movements grew slower, more hesitant, as fear clawed at the edges of my mind. Then came the spears. I didn't hear them at first. The wind and whispers masked the faint sound of footsteps below. But as I reached for another handhold, a sharp whistling sound cut through the air, followed by the impact of something striking the wall just inches from my hand. I froze, my heart stopping for a fraction of a second. Slowly I glanced down and my stomach dropped. The monks had seen me. Their lifeless faces tilted upward, their hollow eyes fixed on me. In their hands they carried crude but deadly weapons, spears, jagged and rusted, yet sharp enough to kill. One of them raised their weapon, pulling back their arm before hurling it with unnatural precision. The spear flew through the air, narrowly missing me and embedding itself in the wall just below my foot. The impact sent a jolt through the stone, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the entire section of the wall might collapse. I had to move, now. Ignoring the pain and exhaustion, I began to climb faster, my fingers scrambling for holds as the monks continued their assault. Spears whistled past me, some missing by mere inches, others grazing the wall so close that I could feel the vibrations through the stone. One of them struck my side, the jagged tip tearing through my clothes and slicing into my flesh. I cried out, the pain sharp and immediate, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Blood seeped from the wound, warm and sticky as it trickled down my side, but I forced myself to keep going. Each step was a battle, each movement a fight against gravity, exhaustion, and the unrelenting attacks of the monks below. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a narrow ledge. Gasping for air, I hauled myself onto it, collapsing against the cold stone. My body trembled with exhaustion, my muscles screaming in protest. The marks on my skin pulsed faintly, their energy mingling with the pain and adrenaline coursing through me. Above me, the relic's glow was brighter now, its light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The journey wasn't over, not yet, but for the moment, I allowed myself a brief moment of rest, knowing that the hardest part was still to come. The cathedral didn't want me here. The monks didn't want me here. But I was here, and I wasn't leaving without the relic. Whatever it took, I would climb higher. I would face whatever horrors awaited me. I had made a pact, and there was no turning back. The spear tore through my side, but I refused to let go. The ledge I clung to was narrow and crumbling beneath my weight, but it offered no real sanctuary. I pressed my body against the cold stone wall, trying to steady my breath and silence the pounding of my heart. Below, the monks were no longer the lifeless, shuffling husks I had seen before. They moved with eerie precision. Their hollow eyes locked onto me as if they could see through the shadows that clung to me like a second skin. Their chants began low, guttural, and barely audible over the wind that howled around the cathedral's spires. It was an unholy symphony of voices that rose in perfect harmony, their words ancient and incomprehensible. The sound reverberated through the air, vibrating in my bones, filling me with an instinctual sense of dread. And then one of them moved. A monk stepped forward, lifting a rusted spear from the pile of weapons at his feet. He gripped it tightly in his skeletal hands, his hollow gaze never wavering from me. With a slow, deliberate motion, he raised the spear over his head, pulling it back as though aiming. I froze, the weight of his stare pinning me in place. And then he threw it. The spear cut through the air with terrifying speed, a sharp whistle that sent a jolt of fear through me. I twisted my body instinctively, narrowly avoiding the jagged tip as it struck the wall beside me with a dull thud. The impact sent small fragments of stone raining down, the sound amplified by the silence that followed. But the silence didn't last long. The other monks joined in, their movements synchronized as they armed themselves with spears, rusted swords, and jagged daggers. Their chants grew louder, their voices rising to a fever pitch as they began their assault. The next spear wasn't so merciful. I was reaching for another handhold when I felt it, a sharp, searing pain that tore through my side. The force of the impact knocked me against the wall, my fingers barely managing to maintain their grip. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, the edges of my vision darkening as the pain threatened to consume me. I glanced down and saw it, the jagged tip of a spear protruding from my side, its shaft slick with my blood. The pain was unbearable, a fiery agony that radiated through my entire body. My breathing grew ragged, each inhale sending a fresh wave of torment through my chest. But I didn't let go. I couldn't let go. Gritting my teeth, I reached up with my free hand, ignoring the slickness of blood on my fingers as I grabbed hold of another crack in the wall. The spear remained lodged in my side, a cruel reminder of the monk's unrelenting attack, but I forced myself to push through the pain. Another spear flew past me, narrowly missing my shoulder. It struck the stone above my head, the vibration sending a shower of dust and debris cascading down. The monks were relentless, their movements unnaturally fast as they prepared their next assault. "Keep moving," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "Don't stop. Don't let them win." The marks on my skin began to burn, their heat spreading through my body like a lifeline. It was as if they were responding to my desperation, fueling me with a strength I didn't know I had. My fingers dug into the stone, my muscles trembling as I pulled myself upward. The climb became a race against death. Spears rained down around me, their sharp tips embedding themselves in the stone with deadly precision. Some came so close that I could feel the rush of air as they passed, the faint metallic scent of rust mingling with the smell of my own blood. The monks' chants reached a crescendo, their voices echoing through the courtyard below. It was a sound that chilled me to my core, a reminder of the dark power they served and the fate that awaited me if I failed. But I refused to give in. The pain in my side was a constant, gnawing presence, but I used it to fuel my determination. With every step, every pull, I forced myself higher, ignoring the blood that dripped from my wounds and the relentless attacks of the monks below. At one point, a spear grazed my arm, tearing through the fabric of my sleeve and slicing into my skin. The sharp sting made me falter, my foot slipping on the slick stone. For a terrifying moment, I hung there, my body swaying precariously as I struggled to regain my footing. But the marks flared again, their energy coursing through me like a tidal wave. They wouldn't let me fall. I pushed myself upward, my hands raw and bleeding from the rough stone. The cathedral seemed to fight me every step of the way, its walls slick with moisture, its spires twisting upward like jagged claws. The relic's faint glow was my only guide, a beacon that urged me forward despite the odds. As I neared the top of the wall, the monks' chants began to change. Their voices grew harsher, more frenzied, as if they could sense that I was close to escaping their reach. The air around me seemed to thrum with energy, the oppressive weight of the cathedral pressing down harder than ever. One of the monks hurled a spear with inhuman precision, the tip aimed directly at my chest. At the last second, I twisted my body, the spear slicing through the air and missing me by a hair's breadth. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through my side, but I gritted my teeth and kept climbing. Finally, my hand grasped the edge of the wall. With one final surge of strength, I pulled myself over, collapsing onto the narrow ledge above. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, the burning in my side nearly unbearable. But I was alive. Below, the monks continued their chants, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They didn't try to follow, as if the ledge was beyond their reach or their purpose. For now, I was safe. I pressed my hand to my side, feeling the warmth of my blood as it seeped through my fingers. The spear had been cruel, but it hadn't killed me. The marks on my skin pulsed faintly, their energy keeping me alive, their whispers urging me onward. The relic was close now. I could feel its presence, a faint hum that vibrated through the air. But the climb had left me weakened, and the monk's attack had been a harsh reminder of the dangers that awaited me. This was no ordinary task. The cathedral wasn't just a building, and the monks weren't just guards. They were part of something far greater, something darker. But I had made a pact, and I would see it through, no matter the cost. After the harrowing climb and the relentless assault of the monks, I finally reached a narrow, crumbling ledge that led to an arched opening in the cathedral wall. The faint glow of the relic seeped through the cracks around the archway, its light a flickering invitation into the unknown. My breaths were ragged, each one a struggle against the burning pain in my side. My hands, raw and bloodied from the climb, trembled as I pressed them against the cold stone to steady myself. I didn't want to move forward, not yet. The marks on my skin pulsed faintly, their energy keeping me upright despite my injuries, but I couldn't shake the weight of dread that seemed to hang in the air. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to abandon this cursed task and escape while I still could. but I couldn't. The pact had been made. Summoning the last remnants of my strength, I stepped through the archway. The air inside was thick, oppressive, and carried a metallic tang that stung my nostrils. The temperature dropped sharply, the chill biting through my tattered clothes and settling deep in my bones. The walls of the corridor leading to the relic room were etched with intricate carvings, their shapes twisting and writhing as though alive. The faint light from the relic illuminated them just enough to make out their forms figures in torment, their faces contorted in agony as shadowy tendrils wrapped around them. As I moved deeper, the carvings seemed to come to life. The figures' eyes followed me, their mouths moving silently as if screaming words I couldn't hear. I averted my gaze, focusing instead on the faint glow ahead. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, and the relic lay at its heart. It sat atop a raised pedestal, its glow casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. At first glance, it seemed almost mundane, a small golden object no larger than my fist. But the longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to change. Its shape twisted and morphed, cycling through forms that defied logic. One moment it was a sphere, smooth and perfect, and the next it was jagged and angular, its edges sharp enough to cut. I took a hesitant step forward, my boots echoing against the cold, uneven stone of the floor. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My breathing became shallow, my chest tightening as if the room itself was resisting my presence. The relic pulsed, its light flickering in time with the marks on my skin. They burned hotter now, a searing heat that made me wince with every step. It was as though the marks and the relic were connected, their energies drawn to one another in a way I couldn't understand. I reached the edge of the pedestal and stopped, staring up at the object that had brought me here. Up close, the relic was even more unsettling. Its surface shimmered with an unnatural light, and faint patterns seemed to dance across it, patterns that mirrored the marks etched into my skin. For a moment I hesitated. This was it. The first relic. The first step in fulfilling the pact I had made. But as I reached out, my hand trembling, a wave of dread washed over me. The air around the relic shifted, distorting like heat waves rising from asphalt. The shadows on the walls grew darker, stretching and writhing as if alive. The carvings of tormented figures seemed to move, their silent screams growing louder in my mind. And then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you think you are worthy?" I froze, my hand hovering inches above the relic. The voice was deep and resonant, carrying an unearthly weight that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't the voice of the monks or the figures who had made the pact. It was something else, something older, darker. The shadows around the room coalesced, gathering at the edges of the chamber. They rose like waves, their forms indistinct but menacing. Eyes, dozens of them, appeared within the darkness, glowing faintly with an eerie light. They watched me, unblinking, their gaze filled with malice. The whisper came again, louder this time. "You are nothing. You are broken. You are weak. Turn back now, before it is too late." My chest tightened, fear clawing at the edges of my resolve. But I couldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything I had endured to get here. "I've come too far to turn back," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. The shadows didn't respond, but they didn't dissipate either. They lingered, watching, waiting. The marks on my skin flared again, their heat intensifying until it felt as though my entire body was on fire. The pain was excruciating, but it brought with it a clarity, a reminder of why I was here. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and grasped the relic. The moment my fingers touched its surface, the room erupted in chaos. The relic's light exploded outward, blinding and searing, illuminating every corner of the chamber. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing as the light burned through them. The air was filled with an otherworldly sound, a mix of thunder, whispers, and screams that seemed to reverberate through my very soul. The relic's energy surged through me, its power flooding my body in an overwhelming wave. My vision blurred, my mind bombarded with images, flashes of a world I didn't recognize, a world consumed by darkness and fire. I saw figures like the ones who had made the pact, their forms towering and monstrous, their eyes filled with an ancient hunger. The marks on my skin burned brighter than ever, their patterns shifting and expanding as they absorbed the relic's energy. I could feel them burrowing deeper into my flesh, becoming a part of me in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. When the light finally subsided, I found myself on my knees, the relic clutched tightly in my hand. The shadows were gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the chamber still hummed with residual energy. The relic's glow had dimmed, but it pulsed faintly in my grasp, a reminder of the power it held. I could feel its presence now, a constant thrum in the back of my mind, urging me forward. I had done it. I had claimed the first relic. But as I rose to my feet, the weight of what lay ahead settled over me. This was only the beginning. The pact was far from complete, and the path before me was fraught with even greater dangers. Clutching the relic tightly, I turned and began the journey back, the whispers of the pact echoing in my mind. Don't stop. The fate of the world is in your hands. The relic's faint glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat as I stumbled out of the chamber. My body was battered, my side still bleeding from the monk's earlier attack, but I had the relic in my grasp, a small victory in a war that had barely begun. The cathedral was silent at first, an oppressive, suffocating silence that felt unnatural after the chaos of the relic room. I stepped cautiously into the corridor, my footsteps echoing faintly against the cold stone walls. The air was colder now, biting against my skin and making every breath feel like inhaling shards of glass. And then I heard the sound of movement. It was faint at first, barely audible over the ringing in my ears. A soft shuffling like fabric dragging across the floor, mixed with the unmistakable click of bone on stone. My heart sank. The monks. I clutched the relic tighter, its warmth seeping into my skin as if trying to reassure me. My eyes darted toward the shadows ahead, but there was nothing there, no figures, no glowing eyes, just darkness. And yet, the sound grew louder, closer. Then came the chanting. It started as a low murmur, echoing faintly through the cathedral's labyrinthine halls. The words were guttural, ancient, and filled with a malevolent energy that made the marks on my skin burn. The monks were no longer wandering aimlessly. They were searching for me. I quickened my pace, every step sending sharp jolts of pain through my injured side. The corridor seemed endless, twisting and turning with no clear direction. I could feel the monks closing in, their presence a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest. And then I turned a corner and froze. They were there, a dozen of them, standing motionless in the corridor ahead. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. One by one, they tilted their heads in unison, their movements unnatural and jerky. The chanting grew louder, reverberating through the air and drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. "Stop," one of them hissed, its voice like the scraping of metal against stone. I didn't stop. Gripping the relic tightly, I turned and ran, ignoring the pain that screamed through my body. The monks' footsteps echoed behind me, their speed unnaturally fast as they pursued me through the twisting corridors. I could hear them gaining on me, their ragged breaths and guttural murmurs filling the air. My vision blurred as panic set in, but I forced myself to focus, to keep moving. Every turn felt like a gamble, every step a desperate attempt to stay ahead of the inevitable. But they were faster than I was, and I knew I couldn't outrun them. As I stumbled into a large, open chamber, I realized I was trapped. The walls were too high to climb, the only exit blocked by the approaching monks. My chest heaved as I spun around, searching for any way out, but there was none. The monks entered the chamber, their hollow eyes glowing brighter as they surrounded me. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. One of them stepped forward, raising a rusted blade. And then, the shadows shifted. It started as a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves being blown across the ground. The monks paused, their heads snapping toward the darkness. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a clicking, chittering noise that echoed through the chamber, like the clattering of 1,000 tiny legs. From the shadows they came. A swarm of spiders, countless in number, poured into the chamber like a living flood. Their bodies glistened in the dim light, their legs moving with eerie precision as they advanced. The air was filled with the sound of their movement, a relentless tide that drowned out the monks' chants. The monks turned to face the swarm, their weapons raised, but it was futile. The spiders moved as one, an unrelenting storm of black and red that consumed everything in its path. One of the monks swung its blade, slicing through the air, but the spiders swarmed over him before the blow could land. His hollow scream echoed through the chamber as the swarm enveloped him, their legs wrapping around his body, their fangs sinking into his flesh. The other monks tried to fight, their movements frantic and disorganized, but the swarm was too fast, too precise. They moved like a single, living entity, their bodies flowing over the monks and immobilizing them with terrifying efficiency. I stood frozen, the relic clutched tightly in my hands as the swarm closed in around me. Their legs clicked against the stone floor, their bodies brushing against my boots, but they didn't attack. Instead, they formed a circle around me, their movements synchronized as if awaiting a command. From the darkness, she emerged. The spider. Her form was colossal, her body a massive glistening black chitin that shimmered faintly in the relic's light. Her eyes, dozens of them, gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting the chaos around her. She moved with a grace that belied her size, her legs clicking softly against the stone as she approached. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her presence was overwhelming, a mixture of primal fear and awe that left me rooted in place. The monks, now completely immobilized, were dragged into the shadows by the swarm, their guttural chants fading into silence. The Spider Queen stopped in front of me, her massive form towering over mine. Her eyes studied me, unblinking, as if weighing my worth. The marks on my skin burned hotter, their patterns shifting and writhing as if responding to her presence. "You have taken what was promised," she said, her voice a low, resonant hum that echoed in my mind. "But you are not ready." Her words sent a chill through me. Not ready. What did that mean? Before I could respond, she reached out with one of her legs, the tip brushing against my chest. The touch was surprisingly gentle, but it sent a jolt of energy through my body. "Do better next time," she said, her voice tinged with something that might have been amusement or warning. With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, the swarm following her like a living tide. The chamber was silent once more, the only sound my ragged breathing and the faint hum of the relic in my hands. I didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. Clutching the relic tightly, I stumbled toward the exit, the marks on my skin burning with a newfound intensity. The first test was complete, but the journey ahead would only grow darker. And I wasn't sure if I would survive it. The chamber felt impossibly still after the swarm had receded, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a heavy weight. The faint hum of the relic in my hands was the only sound that broke the quiet, its rhythmic pulse matching the erratic beat of my heart. My body trembled, battered and bloodied, and my mind was clouded with a toxic mix of exhaustion and dread. I didn't have time to linger. I knew the monks would return, perhaps in greater numbers, or something worse might come crawling from the cathedral's depths. Clutching the relic tightly, I forced my body to move, limping toward the nearest corridor in search of an escape. The cathedral's oppressive presence hadn't eased. Its walls seemed to breathe, the stone alive with an ancient, malevolent energy. Every step I took echoed unnaturally loud, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings and twisting into distorted whispers. I didn't trust the silence. It felt like the building itself was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. As I stumbled through the winding halls, I became acutely aware of the weight of my situation. The relic was in my possession, but I had no clear path out of this labyrinthine nightmare. My injuries slowed me, each step sending sharp jolts of pain through my side where the monk's spear had struck. Blood seeped through my clothes, leaving a dark trail behind me, a beacon for whatever might still be hunting me. Then I heard it. A distant sound, faint but unmistakable footsteps. Not the slow, shuffling steps of the monks, but something heavier, faster. Panic surged through me as I realized that whatever was coming, it was closing in. I quickened my pace, ignoring the burning pain in my side, and searched desperately for a way out. The corridor led to a massive hall, its high windows letting in faint slivers of the gray, overcast sky. The air was colder here, a chill biting against my skin and making it harder to breathe. At the far end of the hall was a grand staircase that spiraled downward, but the sound of footsteps echoed from below, cutting off that route. Trapped. I scanned the hall, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, searching for another escape. My gaze fell on one of the high windows, its glass cracked and fogged with age. It was narrow, barely wide enough for me to fit through, but it was the only option. Beyond it, I could see the faint outlines of the desolate town below, a dizzying drop that promised certain death. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't have time to hesitate. With a deep breath, I staggered toward the window, my hands trembling as I reached for the edges of the frame. The glass was cold and brittle under my touch, and it shattered easily as I pushed against it, the shards falling in a cascade to the ground far below. A gust of icy wind rushed through the opening, stinging my face and forcing me to squint against its force. I glanced back over my shoulder, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, its form obscured by shadow. It wasn't one of the monks. This was something else, something far more menacing. Its presence filled the air with a suffocating weight, and even from a distance I could feel its eyes on me, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Without thinking, I climbed onto the narrow ledge of the window, the wind whipping around me and threatening to pull me off balance. My heart raced as I looked down at the town below, the ground seeming to tilt and shift beneath me. The drop was impossibly far, the kind of fall that wouldn't just kill me, it would obliterate me. But I had no choice. The figure began to move, its footsteps slow and deliberate as it advanced toward me. I could feel its power radiating through the hall, a dark, oppressive energy that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. My fingers tightened around the edges of the window frame as I tried to steady myself, the relic pulsing in my other hand like a living heart. "I'm not going to die here," I whispered to myself, though my voice trembled with doubt. And then I jumped. The air rushed past me in a deafening roar, the wind tearing at my clothes and ripping the breath from my lungs. My body twisted and tumbled as I fell, the world around me a blur of gray and black. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity as I plummeted toward the ground. I braced myself for the impact, for the shattering pain that would end it all, but it never came. Instead, I felt something catch me. It was soft but unyielding, a strange sensation that sent a jolt through my body. The wind stopped, and the world around me stilled. For a moment I couldn't process what had happened. My mind, still braced for death, struggled to comprehend the impossible. I opened my eyes and froze. I wasn't on the ground. I was on a bed of spiders. Thousands, no, tens of thousands of them, their black bodies glistening in the faint light. Their legs moved in perfect synchronization, creating a living, shifting surface that held me aloft. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying, and I felt my stomach churn as I realized the sheer number of them. They weren't attacking me. They weren't even reacting to my presence. They simply carried me, their movements eerily precise as they began to move. The swarm flowed like a river, their bodies undulating in waves as they carried me away from the cathedral and into the shadows of the town. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to fight against the countless legs and fangs that surrounded me, but I was too exhausted, too overwhelmed. The relic still pulsed faintly in my hand, its warmth a strange comfort amidst the nightmare. The spiders moved swiftly, their path weaving through the ruins of the town with an intelligence that seemed almost human. They avoided the jagged remains of buildings, slipping through cracks and crevices with ease. I could feel their legs beneath me, countless points of contact that should have felt suffocating but instead carried me with a surprising gentleness. After what felt like hours, the swarm came to a stop. I looked around and realized we were in a cave, its walls slick with moisture and its air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The spiders lowered me gently to the ground, their bodies retreating in a coordinated wave until I was alone. And then, from the shadows, she appeared again. The Spider Queen. Her massive form filled the cave, her countless eyes glinting like dark jewels. She regarded me with a calm intensity, her legs clicking softly against the stone as she approached. "You jumped," she said, her voice resonating through the cave. "You trusted the unknown." I couldn't respond. My body trembled, my mind racing as I tried to process everything that had happened. "You will need that courage," she continued, her voice both a warning and a promise. "The road ahead will test you in ways you cannot imagine." With that, she turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the faint glow of the relic in my hands and the marks on my skin burning brighter than ever. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same person who had entered the cathedral, and whatever awaited me next, I would face it, because I had no choice. The cave was silent after the swarm retreated, leaving only the faint, rhythmic sound of my own breathing. I sat motionless on the damp, uneven ground, clutching the relic to my chest as though it were a lifeline. The flickering light of its glow reflected off the cave walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with an unnerving life of their own. And then I felt a presence. It wasn't the sudden, shocking realization of being watched. This was different. It was heavier, older, as if the very air in the cave had shifted to make room for something far greater than myself. The marks on my skin began to burn again, not with the searing pain I'd felt before, but with a warmth that spread through my body like a warning. She was coming. The first sign was the sound, a faint, rhythmic clicking that echoed softly against the cave walls. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, accompanied by the faint scraping of something enormous moving through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the source of the sound. The shadows at the far end of the cave seemed to ripple, folding in on themselves like a living entity. And then, out of the darkness, she emerged. She was colossal, her sheer size dwarfing everything in the cave. Her body was a masterpiece of nightmares, covered in sleek, glistening black chitin that seemed to shimmer faintly in the relic's light. Her legs, long and spindly, moved with an unsettling grace, their sharp tips clicking against the stone as she approached. But it was her eyes that held me captive. Dozens of them, arranged in a pattern that was both symmetrical and disturbingly alien. They weren't cold or cruel, as I might have expected. Instead, they were calm, impossibly deep, like wells of infinite darkness that seemed to peer into my very soul. There was no hatred in her gaze, no malice, no joy, just an unnerving calm that made me feel small and insignificant. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything to escape her gaze, but my body refused to obey. It was as though the weight of her presence alone had rooted me to the spot, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. When she spoke, her voice was a low, resonant hum that echoed not just in the cave, but in my mind. It wasn't a sound so much as a presence, a vibration that seemed to wrap around my thoughts and pull me into its rhythm. "You have done well to come this far," she said, her voice steady and measured. "Few survive the trials of the cathedral, and fewer still leave with what they seek." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. You saved me," I managed to whisper, though my voice was shaky and uncertain. Her massive head tilted slightly, her eyes narrowing as though she were studying me. "Saved you? No, I merely allowed you to continue. There is a difference." Her words sent a chill through me, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. Whatever she had done, it hadn't been out of kindness or mercy. She had her own reasons I couldn't begin to understand. "You carry the relic," she continued, her gaze shifting briefly to the faint glow in my hands. "It is a fragment of great power, one that has claimed many before you, and yet you are still here, still standing." "Barely," I said, my voice tinged with bitterness. Her eyes flicked back to mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faintest glimmer of amusement in their depths. "Strength is not measured by the absence of struggle," she said. "It is measured by your ability to endure." She moved closer, her massive form looming over me. Despite her size, her movements were eerily silent, her legs barely making a sound as they touched the ground. I tensed, my grip tightening on the relic, but she didn't strike. Instead, she lowered herself slightly, bringing her face level with mine. "You have been marked," she said, her voice softer now. "Bound by a pact that you do not yet understand. The power it grants you is not a gift. It is a burden, one that will shape you in ways you cannot yet foresee." I looked down at the marks on my arms, the dark, twisted patterns pulsing faintly against my skin. They felt heavier now, their presence a constant reminder of the deal I had made. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She tilted her head again, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Want? Nothing. Your path is your own. I am merely an observer. But know this, the relic you carry is only the beginning. The journey ahead will test you, break you, and reshape you. And if you falter, if you fail..." Her words trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. I swallowed hard, the weight of her presence pressing down on me. And if I succeed? For the first time, her gaze seemed to soften, though the calm in her eyes remained unnerving. "Then you will become something far greater than you are now. But greatness does not come without cost. Remember that." The cave fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I couldn't bring myself to respond, couldn't find the words to express the storm of emotions that churned within me. After a long moment, she began to retreat, her massive form disappearing back into the shadows. The clicking of her legs echoed softly as she moved, growing fainter with each step. But before she vanished completely, she spoke once more. "Do better next time." Her words were both a command and a challenge, a cryptic reminder that my journey was far from over. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the cave. The relic's faint glow seemed dimmer now, its light barely illuminating the marks on my skin. I stared down at it, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The spider's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the impossible path that lay ahead. I didn't know what she was, or why she had spared me, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The relic in my hands was a piece of something far greater, far darker, and the journey to claim the others would push me to the brink. But I couldn't turn back now. The pact was made, the marks burned into my flesh, and the fate of whatever world I had left rested on my shoulders. Taking a deep breath, I pushed myself to my feet, the pain in my side a dull ache that I forced to the back of my mind. The cave was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. But I was alive, and as long as I lived, I would keep moving forward. Because I had no choice. The journey to the abyss was a grueling one, but it was nothing compared to the sight that greeted me when I finally arrived. For hours, or was it days, I had traversed the desolate wasteland that stretched beyond the cathedral. The air was heavier here, the silence more profound, broken only by the occasional groan of the earth beneath my feet. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I pressed forward, guided only by the faint pulsing of the marks on my skin and the relentless pull of the pact. And then I saw it. The abyss. It wasn't just a chasm in the ground, it was a tear in reality itself, the gaping maw that seemed to devour the very fabric of existence. The ground ended abruptly, crumbling into jagged edges that jutted out like broken teeth. Beyond that, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sign of life, just an infinite void that stretched endlessly in all directions. The darkness was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't the absence of light, it was a presence, a living, breathing entity that seemed to ripple and shift like black water. The air around it was cold, far colder than the biting winds of the wasteland. Each breath burned in my lungs, as though the darkness itself was seeping into me, stealing the warmth from my body. I stood at the edge, staring down into the void, my mind struggling to comprehend what lay before me. The relic was down there, I could feel it, its presence like a faint hum vibrating through the air. But reaching it meant descending into the abyss, into a place where light dared not enter and the whispers of unseen entities echoed in the void. The whispers began softly, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. At first they were indistinct, a faint murmur at the edges of my consciousness. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, they grew louder, more insistent. "Come," they said, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. "Come to us. You seek what is hidden. You seek the truth. But are you ready to pay the price?" I shivered, the voices cutting through me like shards of ice. They weren't coming from the abyss itself, they were inside my head, twisting and coiling around my thoughts like serpents. Each word carried a weight that pressed down on me, threatening to pull me into the void. The marks on my skin burned hotter, their patterns shifting and writhing as though alive. They pulsed in time with the whispers, their energy pushing back against the oppressive presence of the abyss. It was as though they were urging me forward, forcing me to confront the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to the edge. The ground beneath my feet was unstable, crumbling away with every movement, but I didn't stop. The relic was down there, and I had made a pact. There was no turning back now. As I stared into the void, the whispers grew more distinct, their words forming coherent sentences that sent chills down my spine. "You think you are strong," one voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. "You think you are ready. But this place will break you. It has devoured many before you," another voice added, colder and more detached. "What makes you think you will be different?" I clenched my fists, the relic in my grasp glowing faintly as though in defiance of the darkness. "I'm not like them," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I'm still here." The whispers fell silent for a moment, as though considering my words, and then they laughed. It was a sound that sent shivers through my entire body, a chilling, inhuman laughter that echoed in the void and reverberated in my skull. It was the sound of something ancient, something cruel, mocking my resolve. And then the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, the world around me spinning as I tumbled into the darkness. The wind roared in my ears, pulling at my clothes and ripping the breath from my lungs. The faint glow of the relic was my only anchor, its light barely illuminating the void around me. The descent felt endless, the abyss swallowing me whole as I plunged deeper into its depths. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. They spoke of my fears, my failures, my doubts, each word cutting into me like a blade. "You are nothing. You will fail. Turn back before it's too late." But there was no turning back. The marks on my skin flared with a searing heat, their energy pushing against the oppressive weight of the darkness. They were my lifeline, my tether to the world above, and I clung to their presence with everything I had. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. I landed hard, the impact jarring my entire body and knocking the air from my lungs. The ground beneath me was cold and unyielding, its surface rough and uneven. For a moment I lay there, gasping for breath, the relic clutched tightly in my hands. When I finally managed to sit up, I realized I was no longer alone. The shadows around me shifted, coalescing into shapes that defied logic. Eyes, dozens of them, blinked open in the darkness, their faint glow casting an eerie light across the abyss. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms twisted and grotesque, their movements unnaturally fluid. They circled me, their eyes fixed on the relic in my hands. "You have come far," one of them said, its voice low and rumbling. "But the journey is not over. The relic you seek lies deeper still." Another figure stepped forward, its face obscured by the darkness. "The abyss tests all who enter," it said. "Many have tried, all have failed. Will you be any different?" I pushed myself to my feet, my body trembling but defiant. "I'll find it," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that churned within me. "Whatever it takes, I'll find it." The figures didn't respond. They simply watched as I took a step forward, their eyes following my every move. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, the whispers growing louder with each step I took. The second relic awaited me, hidden deep within the infinite abyss. And I would face whatever horrors lay ahead because I had no choice. I had made a pact. Bond. The abyss stretched before me, an endless expanse of shifting blackness that swallowed everything in its path. The air was thick and cloying, clinging to my skin like an unwelcome second layer. Every breath was a struggle, the dense atmosphere pressing against my chest and filling my lungs with a cold that seeped deep into my bones. The path forward was unclear. The faint light of the relic in my hands illuminated only a few feet ahead, revealing jagged rocks and uneven ground that seemed to shift with each step I took. The marks on my skin burned faintly, their warmth the only reassurance I had in this oppressive void. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, alive and aware. It rippled and twisted around me, brushing against my arms and legs like invisible tendrils. I could feel it pressing against me, probing, as though testing my resolve. It wasn't just the air that felt alive, the darkness itself seemed to breathe, its presence a constant reminder that I was not alone. And then there were the eyes. They appeared at the edges of my vision, faint glimmers in the blackness that disappeared the moment I turned to look. At first I thought I was imagining them, my mind playing tricks on me in this void where reality felt slippery and unreliable. But the longer I walked, the more certain I became. Something was watching me. No, not something. Many things. The eyes were everywhere, peering out from cracks in the rock, glinting faintly in the void, always just out of reach. Some were small and narrow, blinking rapidly as they followed my every move. Others were large and unblinking, their gaze heavy and oppressive. I couldn't tell if they belonged to creatures or if they were simply the abyss itself, manifesting its awareness in a way I could comprehend. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, their words unintelligible but laced with malice. They curled around me like smoke, slipping into my ears and weaving through my thoughts. "Do you feel them?" one voice hissed, barely louder than a breath. "They are waiting," another murmured, its tone laced with anticipation. I gripped the relic tighter, its faint glow a small but defiant beacon in the oppressive dark. The whispers grew louder as I descended, their tones shifting between mockery and warning. They spoke of my fears, my failures, my weaknesses, each word cutting deeper than the last. "You are nothing without us. You will never survive. Turn back. It is already too late." I shook my head, forcing the voices away. "No," I muttered, though my voice trembled with uncertainty. You're wrong. The path grew narrower, the ground sloping downward at a steep angle that forced me to steady myself against the jagged walls. The rocks were cold and wet beneath my fingers, their surfaces slick with some unknown substance that clung to my skin like oil. Every step was treacherous, the ground shifting beneath my feet as though it were alive. And then I saw movement in the shadows. At first it was subtle, a faint flicker at the edge of my vision. But as I descended deeper, the shapes became more distinct. They darted between the rocks, their forms fluid and indistinct, like living shadows that melted into the darkness. One of them lingered too long, and I caught a glimpse of it. It was humanoid, but only barely. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnaturally jerky as it crawled along the walls like a spider. Its head tilted toward me, its face obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its gaze sharp and piercing, as though it could see straight through me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the creature paused, its body half hidden behind a jagged rock. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us thick with tension. And then, with a soundless burst of motion, it disappeared into the void. I exhaled shakily, my grip on the relic tightening until my knuckles ached. The marks on my skin burned hotter now, their patterns shifting and writhing, as though reacting to the presence of the creatures. I didn't know what they were, but I knew they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The whispers grew louder, their words merging into a chaotic symphony that made it impossible to think. I pressed on, my footsteps faltering but determined. The path continued to slope downward, the descent growing steeper with every step. The creatures became bolder as I went deeper. They no longer lingered at the edges of my vision. Instead, they moved closer, their forms darting between the rocks, their movements quick and erratic. I could hear them now, the faint scrape of claws against stone, the soft, wet sound of their breathing. One of them came too close, its form emerging from the darkness just a few feet ahead. It was taller than I had expected, its elongated limbs bending unnaturally as it crawled toward me. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that seemed to pulse in time with the whispers. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I raised the relic in front of me. The glow of its light seemed to repel the creature, its form recoiling as though burned. It hissed, a guttural, animalistic sound that made my blood run cold before retreating into the shadows. But it didn't go far. None of them did. They were surrounding me now, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their movements slow and deliberate. The whispers grew deafening, their voices merging into a single, unrelenting roar. And yet, I kept moving. The marks on my skin flared with a heat that was almost unbearable, their energy coursing through me like fire. They pushed me forward, urging me to ignore the creatures, the whispers, the oppressive weight of the abyss itself. The path leveled out at last, opening into a vast chamber that stretched beyond the reach of the relic's light. The air here was colder, heavier, the darkness thicker and more alive than anywhere else. I could feel the presence of the second relic, its energy pulsing faintly in the distance. But the creatures were closer now, their forms emerging fully from the shadows as they circled the chamber. Their eyes burned with hunger, their bodies shifting and writhing as though they were made of the abyss itself. I stood at the edge of the chamber, clutching the relic tightly, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The descent was over, but the true test had only just begun. The second relic awaited me, buried deep within this living nightmare, and I wasn't sure if I would make it out alive. The chamber stretched out before me, a void that seemed endless, its edges swallowed by the oppressive darkness. I could barely make out the faint outline of the ground beneath my feet, jagged and uneven, a treacherous surface that seemed to shift with every step. But ahead of me, cutting through the suffocating black, was the relic of faint, flickering light no brighter than a dying ember. Its glow was weak, as though it were barely clinging to existence, but it called to me with an undeniable pull. The marks on my skin burned hotter as I moved closer, their energy resonating with the relic in a way that made the air around me hum with tension. The closer I got, the heavier the atmosphere became, pressing down on my chest and making each breath a laborious effort. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that seemed to echo from every direction. "Do you feel it?" One voice hissed, its tone laced with venom. "It does not belong to you," another growled, low and guttural. "You are not worthy." Ah. The words burrowed into my mind, gnawing at my resolve, but I pushed them aside. I had come too far, endured too much to falter now. The relic was within reach, and I wasn't leaving without it. As I stepped closer, the shadows around me began to shift. It weren't just the absence of light, they were alive, rippling and twisting as though in response to my presence. Eyes blinked open in the darkness, dozens of them, their faint glows creating a mosaic of malevolence that surrounded me. The creatures were watching, waiting, their forms hidden but their intent unmistakable. The relic sat on a pedestal of jagged stone at the center of the chamber. Its surface was smooth and dark, almost like obsidian, but it pulsed faintly with a crimson light that seemed to grow stronger as I approached. The light wasn't warm or inviting, it was cold and unsettling. A reminder that this wasn't a treasure to be taken lightly. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the relic. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming warnings, threats, and promises of doom. The shadows around the room grew darker, denser, their movements more erratic. "Take it," one voice said, sharp and commanding. "Leave it," another growled, its tone dripping with malice. "Choose." I closed my eyes, trying to drown out the chaos, and reached out. The moment my fingers touched the surface of the relic, the chamber erupted in chaos. The shadows reacted violently, their forms coalescing into monstrous shapes that lunged toward me with a ferocity that made my heart stop. The creatures I had glimpsed earlier now fully emerged, their bodies twisted and grotesque, their limbs too long and their faces distorted beyond recognition. They moved with terrifying speed, their claws scraping against the stone as they closed in. I clutched the relic tightly, its surface cold and unyielding against my palm. The marks on my skin flared with an intensity that sent searing pain through my entire body, but they also unleashed a surge of energy that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. The first creature lunged, its clawed hand swiping toward me with deadly precision. I barely managed to dodge the relic's faint light illuminating its hollow, gaping face for a split second before it disappeared into the shadows again. The others followed, their movements a blur as they darted around me, testing my defenses. I stumbled back, my breathing ragged, the oppressive weight of the chamber threatening to crush me. But the relic wasn't just a burden, it was a weapon. The moment I held it aloft, its glow intensified, pulsing in time with the marks on my skin. A wave of crimson light erupted from its surface, cutting through the shadows and forcing the creatures to retreat. They screeched in pain, their distorted voices echoing through the chamber as they recoiled from the relic's power. But the reprieve was short-lived. The shadows regrouped, their movements more coordinated, their attacks more calculated. They circled me like predators stalking prey, their glowing eyes fixed on the relic with a hunger that made my stomach churn. I could feel the relic's energy coursing through me, a volatile force that threatened to consume me if I didn't control it. The marks on my skin burned brighter, their patterns shifting and writhing as though alive. They whispered to me now, their voices distinct from the chaos around me. Fight. The first creature lunged again, and this time I didn't retreat. The relic pulsed in my hand, its light cutting through the darkness as I swung it toward the creature. The crimson glow struck it mid-lunge, the energy slicing through its form like a blade. It screeched, its body dissolving into wisps of shadow that dissipated into the void. The other creatures hesitated, their movements faltering as they watched their companion fall. But their hesitation didn't last long. One by one they attacked, their forms a blur of claws and fangs. I fought back with everything I had, the relic's power surging through me in waves. Each strike sent pulses of crimson light through the chamber, cutting down the shadows one by one. But the effort took its toll. The marks on my skin burned hotter with every attack, their energy draining me with every pulse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chamber fell silent. The creatures were gone, their forms dissolved into the void, leaving only the oppressive darkness behind. The relic's glow dimmed, its light no longer the fierce, pulsating beacon it had been moments ago. I collapsed to my knees, the relic still clutched tightly in my hands. My body trembled, every muscle screaming in protest, but I was alive. The second relic was mine. The whispers had stopped, the oppressive presence of the shadows fading into silence. But the tension in the air remained, a reminder that this victory had come at a cost. As I stood, the marks on my skin burned faintly, their patterns more vivid than ever. The relic's energy pulsed in time with my heartbeat, its presence a constant weight in the back of my mind. The second test was over, but the journey was far from complete. The abyss had tested me, and though I had survived, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had left a mark on me, one that went far deeper than the pact I had made. With the relic in hand, I turned and began the long climb out of the abyss, the shadows watching me every step of the way. The moment I turned to leave the chamber, the darkness came alive. It started with the whispers, low and fragmented, slipping into the edges of my mind. They had been faint before, distant murmurs that seemed to mock me from afar. But now they were louder, sharper, each word cutting into me like shards of ice. You shouldn't have taken it. You don't belong here. You will never escape. I tightened my grip on the relic, its faint, pulsing glow the only light in the oppressive void. The marks on my skin burned hotter, their energy crackling like embers beneath my flesh. They pushed me forward, urging me to move, to run, to get as far away from the abyss as possible. And then I heard them. At first, it was just the faint sound of movement, the scrape of claws against stone, the rustle of something shifting in the shadows. But it grew louder, closer, until it became an overwhelming cacophony of noise. The creatures were coming. I didn't wait to see them. My instincts took over, and I ran. The ground beneath me was unstable, shifting and crumbling with every step. The faint glow of the relic illuminated just enough of the path to keep me from stumbling into the void. but the rest of the abyss was an endless sea of black. The air was cold and heavy, each breath burning in my lungs as I pushed myself forward. Behind me, the sound of the creatures grew louder. Their movements were erratic, a chaotic blend of scraping claws, guttural growls, and the faint, wet sound of something dragging itself across the stone. I could feel their presence pressing against me, an oppressive weight that made my skin crawl. The whispers were relentless, their voices blending with the creature's sounds until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. You cannot escape. You are ours now. Now. Run, little thief, run. I didn't dare look back. The path began to slope upward, the ground growing steeper and more uneven. My boots slipped on the damp stone, the jagged edges cutting into my hands as I scrambled forward. The air was colder now, biting against my skin and numbing my fingers. And still, they followed. I could feel their cold breath on my neck, a chilling reminder of how close they were. The shadows around me rippled and twisted, their forms coalescing into shapes that darted just out of reach. Every now and then I caught glimpses of glowing eyes in the darkness, their sickly light burning into me with a predatory intensity. One of the creatures lunged. I didn't see it coming, but I felt the rush of air as its claws swiped just inches from my back. The force of its attack sent me stumbling forward, my knees hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my legs, but I forced myself back up, the relic's faint glow a constant reminder of what I was fighting for. Another creature struck, its elongated limbs reaching out from the shadows. I twisted just in time, the jagged tips of its claws grazing my arm and leaving a burning trail of pain. The marks on my skin flared in response, their energy surging through me like a burst of fire. It wasn't just pain I felt, it was anger, defiance, a refusal to be consumed by the abyss. The relic in my hands pulsed in time with the marks, its light growing brighter, as though feeding off my determination. I swung the relic toward the nearest creature, and the crimson light erupted in a blinding flash. The creature recoiled, its distorted form dissolving into wisps of shadow as it let out a guttural scream. But there were more of them. They swarmed from the edges of the path, their movements erratic and frenzied. Their bodies twisted and shifted, their forms barely human, with two long limbs and faces obscured by darkness. They moved like predators, their glowing eyes fixed on me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I ran faster, my breaths ragged, shallow, each step a desperate attempt to put distance between me and the horde. The path narrowed as I climbed, the jagged walls pressing in on either side. The creatures followed, their movements unnaturally fluid as they crawled along the walls and ceiling, their claws scraping against the stone. One of them dropped down in front of me, its form blocking the narrow path. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and shadow, its mouth twisted into a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. It lunged, its claws outstretched, but the relic flared again, its light slicing through the creature like a blade. The shadows around me writhed in agony, their movements growing more frantic as the relic's light pushed them back. But I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. The slope grew steeper, the ground crumbling beneath my feet as I climbed. My muscles burned with exhaustion, my injured arm throbbing with every movement. The air grew colder still, the chill sinking deep into my bones. And then I saw a faint glimmer of light in the distance. It wasn't the cold, oppressive light of the relic or the sickly glow of the creature's eyes. It was warm, golden, and inviting, a beacon that promised safety. The exit. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning pain in my legs and the searing heat of the marks on my skin. The creatures were closing in, their guttural growls and scraping claws growing louder with every step. One of them lunged again, its claws grazing my side and tearing through my clothes. I stumbled, the force of the attack nearly knocking me off balance, but I managed to stay on my feet. The light grew brighter, the warmth of its glow cutting through the cold of the abyss. The creatures hesitated, their movements faltering as the light reached them. I didn't stop. With one final burst of energy, I lunged toward the exit, the relic's light flaring one last time as I crossed the threshold. The creatures let out a chorus of screams, their distorted voices echoing through the abyss as they retreated into the shadows. The light enveloped me, its warmth washing over me like a wave. The air was different here, lighter, cleaner, free of the oppressive weight of the abyss. I collapsed onto the ground, the relic still clutched tightly in my hands, my body trembling with exhaustion. The marks on my skin burned faintly, their patterns pulsing in time with the relic's glow. I had escaped the abyss, but the memory of its darkness lingered, a haunting reminder of what I had faced. The second relic was mine, but the cost of claiming it had left me shaken, scarred and uncertain of what lay ahead. As I lay there, staring up at the faint light of the sky above, I knew one thing for certain. The journey was far from over. The pact I had made still bound me, and the final relic awaited. And it would be waiting in a place even darker than the abyss. The city rose from the horizon like a festering wound on the landscape. Its jagged skyline was a chaotic mess of leaning towers and crumbling spires, their surfaces blackened by smoke and grime. The air itself seemed tainted, a foul mix of rot and sulfur that clung to the back of my throat with every breath. Even from a distance, the city exuded an oppressive weight, as if it were alive and suffering, its pain radiating outward into the desolate wasteland that surrounded it. The closer I got, the worse it became. The stench hit me first, an overwhelming assault of decay, sewage, and something else, something acrid and chemical, like the residue of experiments gone horribly wrong. My boots sank into the muck that coated the streets leading into the city, a sludge of unknown origins that bubbled and hissed faintly in the dim light. The relic pulsed faintly in my hand, its light barely cutting through the smog that hung heavy in the air. The marks on my skin burned as I approached the city's gates, their patterns shifting and writhing in response to the malevolent energy that seemed to emanate from the place. The gates were massive, made of rusted iron and adorned with grotesque carvings that depicted scenes of suffering and torment. Figures writhed in agony, their faces twisted into expressions of despair, while shadowy shapes loomed over them, watching with cruel indifference. The carvings were so detailed that they almost seemed to move, their eyes following me as I approached. The gates groaned as they swung open, the sound reverberating through the air like a dying scream. Beyond them lay the city, a labyrinth of narrow streets and towering buildings that seemed to lean in on themselves, their walls cracked and crumbling. I stepped inside, and the gates slammed shut behind me with a deafening clang. The city was alive with movement, but not the kind that brought comfort or familiarity. Shadows darted across the streets, their forms too quick and distorted to fully discern. Figures lurked in the alleyways, their eyes glinting faintly in the gloom. The streets were lined with stalls and carts, their wares a bizarre assortment of items, rusted weapons, vials of unidentifiable liquids, and strange trinkets that seemed to hum with a faint, dark energy. The vendors were no better than their goods. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken and hollow, their skin pale and stretched thin over their bones. They spoke in low, hushed tones, their voices carrying a nervous edge as if afraid to be overheard. The whispers were back, weaving through the air like a constant, unseen presence. They weren't as loud as they had been in the abyss, but they were no less unsettling. It watches. It knows you're here. You won't leave. I kept my head down, avoiding the gaze of the vendors and the figures lurking in the shadows. The relic in my hand pulsed faintly, its light drawing nervous glances from those who saw it. They didn't approach me, but their eyes followed my every move, filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. The streets twisted and turned, forming a maze that seemed designed to confuse and trap. Each corner I turned brought me face to face with another disturbing sight. A man hunched over, whispering to himself as he scratched at the walls. A group of children with pale, lifeless eyes, their laughter echoing unnaturally as they played with broken bones. A woman draped in tattered cloth, her hands clutching a bundle that writhed as though alive. I pressed on, ignoring the growing sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The relic's pull grew stronger with each step, guiding me deeper into the heart of the city. The marks on my skin burned hotter, their energy pushing me forward, even as the oppressive atmosphere threatened to crush me. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't just the vendors or the figures in the alleyways, something far greater was observing me, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. I could feel it in the air, a presence that pressed against me like an invisible weight. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting, biding its time. The streets grew darker as I moved deeper into the city, the smog thickening until it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The buildings loomed higher, their walls covered in graffiti that seemed to shift and writhe as I passed. The whispers grew louder, their voices more distinct. The relic is close. It will not let you take it. You are not the first. You will not be the last. I came to a stop in a narrow alley, the walls on either side pressing in like a vice. The relic's light pulsed brightly now, illuminating a path that led to a crumbling staircase at the end of the alley. The marks on my skin burned like fire, their energy surging through me as though in anticipation. The staircase led to a decrepit building, its facade cracked and covered in grime. The windows were shattered, the glass shards scattered across the ground like jagged teeth. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rot, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the darkness. The relic's glow lit the way, revealing a series of narrow corridors that twisted and turned like the streets outside. The whispers followed me, their voices growing louder with each step. The presence watching me felt closer now, its gaze a tangible force that made my skin crawl. At the end of the corridor, I found it. The room was small and unassuming, its walls bare and crumbling. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it sat the third relic. Its glow was faint, a sickly green light that pulsed weakly as though struggling to stay alive. But as I reached for it, the shadows in the room began to shift. They rose from the corners, coalescing into forms that were both human and monstrous. Their eyes glowed faintly, their bodies twisting and writhing as though made of liquid darkness. They moved closer, their steps silent but deliberate, their gaze fixed on the relic. The whispers grew deafening, their voices merging into a single, chaotic roar. The marks on my skin flared with the searing heat, their patterns writhing and twisting in response to the dark energy that filled the room. I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I reached for the relic. The third test had begun. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own as I stood before the third relic. Its faint, sickly green light illuminated the crumbling walls, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The whispers had risen to a fever pitch, their chaotic voices merging into a cacophony that reverberated through the air. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered above the relic. But the moment my fingers brushed its surface, the entire building seemed to come alive. The floor beneath me groaned and shifted, the sound of grinding stone filling the air. The walls rippled, cracks spreading across their surfaces like veins. The relic pulsed in my hand, its light flickering as though in distress. The marks on my skin burned hotter than ever, their energy coursing through me in waves that left me breathless. And then the shadows attacked. They rose from the corners of the room, twisting and writhing as they coalesced into monstrous forms. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green that mirrored the light of the relic. Their bodies were indistinct, shifting between human and inhuman shapes as they moved toward me. The first one lunged, its clawed hands swiping through the air with a speed that caught me off guard. I barely managed to dodge, the relic's light flaring as I raised it in front of me. The creature recoiled, its distorted form dissolving into wisps of shadow before reforming a few feet away. I didn't have time to process what was happening. The other shadows closed in, their movements erratic and terrifying. They swarmed around me, their claws scraping against the walls and floor as they circled like predators preparing to strike. The marks on my skin flared again, their energy pushing back against the oppressive weight of the shadows. I swung the relic toward the nearest creature, its light cutting through the darkness like a blade. The creature screamed, its voice a piercing, otherworldly sound that made my ears ring. But for every shadow I destroyed, another took its place. The room was collapsing around me, the walls crumbling and the floor buckling under the strain. Dust filled the air, mixing with the acrid scent of decay and smoke. The city itself was fighting back, its very foundation reacting to my presence as though it were a living entity determined to protect its secrets. I stumbled toward the doorway, clutching the relic tightly as I fought to keep my balance. The shadows pursued me, their forms darting through the collapsing room with unnerving agility. Every step I took felt like a battle, the ground shifting beneath my feet and the oppressive energy of the city pressing down on me like a weight I could barely carry. The hallway outside was no better. The walls were alive with movement, dark tendrils snaking out from the cracks and reaching for me as I ran. The whispers followed me, their voices growing louder and more frantic. "You cannot take it. It is ours. Ours. You will never leave." The corridor twisted and turned, each corner revealing new horrors. The shadows were everywhere, their glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the chill sinking deep into my bones and making my breath visible in the dim light. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway was a massive, ornate door, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to depict scenes of torment and sacrifice. The relic in my hand pulsed violently as I approached, its light flickering as though warning me of the danger ahead. The door swung open with a deafening groan, revealing a vast chamber bathed in a sickly green light. The floor was covered in jagged tiles that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as I stepped inside. The walls were adorned with grotesque murals, their images too twisted and disturbing to fully comprehend. In the center of the chamber stood a massive, black obelisk, its surface covered in glowing runes that pulsed in time with the relic. At its base was a pedestal, and on that pedestal lay the final relic. Its light was faint, almost imperceptible, but its presence was undeniable. I took a step forward, but the ground beneath me gave way. The floor was a trap, its tiles shifting and collapsing with every movement. I stumbled, barely managing to catch myself as the ground opened up beneath me, revealing a pit filled with writhing shadows. They reached for me, their clawed hands grasping at the edges of the pit as they tried to pull themselves up. The marks on my skin flared again, their energy pushing back against the darkness. I forced myself to keep moving, each step a careful balance between speed and precision. The obelisk loomed closer with every step, its runes glowing brighter as I approached. But the city wasn't done with me yet. The shadows rose from the pits, their forms twisting and stretching as they swarmed toward me. They moved faster now, their movements more coordinated as though driven by a single, malevolent will. I reached the pedestal just as the first shadow lunged. Its claws scraped against the stone as I grabbed the final relic, its surface cold and smooth against my palm. The moment I lifted it, the chamber erupted in chaos. The obelisk shattered, its runes exploding in a burst of green light that sent shockwaves through the room. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke as the light consumed them. The ground shook violently, cracks spreading across the floor and walls as the entire structure began to collapse. I turned and ran, clutching the relics tightly as I navigated the crumbling chamber. The path back was a blur of collapsing stone and screaming shadows, the city's last desperate attempt to stop me. But I didn't stop. The relics burned in my hands, their light guiding me through the chaos as I fought to escape. The marks on my skin burned brighter than ever, their energy surging through me like fire. The moment I crossed the threshold of the chamber, the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the chaos within. The whispers fell silent, the oppressive weight of the city lifting as I stepped back into the alley. The final relic was mine. Mine. But as I stood there, breathing heavily and clutching the relics, I couldn't shake the feeling that the city hadn't been defeated, it had simply let me go. And whatever waited beyond its walls would be far worse. I woke with a jolt, my body drenched in sweat, the relics clutched tightly in my trembling hands. The dim light of the room I had collapsed and offered no comfort, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and dance at the edges of my vision. My heart pounded against my ribs, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as I struggled to shake off the lingering weight of the city's darkness. But the marks on my skin wouldn't let me forget. They burned like fire, their twisted, shifting patterns glowing faintly in the darkness. The energy coursing through them was unbearable, searing every nerve in my body with a heat that felt alive, purposeful. I gritted my teeth, my fingers digging into the cold, smooth surfaces of the relics as though holding onto them might somehow anchor me to reality. The whispers were gone, but their echoes remained, lingering in the back of my mind like ghosts. Their words replayed over and over, a relentless mantra that refused to be silenced. Don't stop. The fate of the world is in your hands. But whose fate, and in what way? I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body protesting the movement. The room was bare, its walls cracked and stained, the remnants of some forgotten building in the heart of a city that seemed determined to destroy me. The relics rested in my lap, their faint light pulsing in unison, their energy resonating with the marks on my skin. The first relic, with its golden glow, felt warm to the touch, a beacon of strength and resilience. The second relic, its crimson light flickering like embers, carried a weight that was both empowering and ominous. The third relic, sickly green and cold as death, radiated a power that sent chills through my body, its presence unnerving and undeniable. Together they were a trinity of forces that defied comprehension. The pack's power surged within me, each mark on my skin a constant reminder of the deal I had made. I could feel the energy coursing through my veins, a volatile force that threatened to consume me if I didn't control it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the question that had been haunting me since the moment this nightmare began. Am I saving the world or destroying it? The answer felt as distant as the stars. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. But the moment I did, images flooded my mind, visions that didn't feel like my own. They came in flashes, fragmented and chaotic, each one more unsettling than the last. I saw a world consumed by darkness, its skies choked with smoke and ash, its cities reduced to ruins. I saw figures like the ones who had offered me the pact, their monstrous forms towering over the broken remnants of humanity, their eyes glowing with ancient, unholy power. And then I saw something else. I saw myself standing at the center of it all, the relics glowing in my hands, the marks on my skin blazing like fire. Around me, the world seemed to shift and warp, as though reality itself were bending to my will. People knelt before me, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and fear, their voices raised in a chant I couldn't understand. But was I their savior or their destroyer? The visions faded, leaving me gasping for air, my hands trembling as I clutched the relics. The marks on my skin flared brighter, their energy surging in response to the chaos within me. I wanted answers, clarity, but the pact had given me nothing but questions. Their words echoed again, louder this time, as though spoken directly into my mind. Don't stop. The fate of the world is in your hands. I stood shakily, my legs threatening to give out beneath me, and forced myself to move. The room around me felt suffocating, its walls pressing in as though the city's malevolence had seeped into the very stone. I needed air, space to think, to breathe. The streets outside were no better. The city's stench still clung to the air, its shadows deeper and darker than before. The figures I had seen earlier were gone, but their presence lingered, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in every corner. I walked aimlessly, the relics heavy in my hands, my thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear. The marks on my skin pulsed with every step, their energy resonating with the city's darkness as though feeding off it. Was this what the pact had been leading me to? I thought back to the moment it all began, the three figures emerging from the shadows, their voices calm yet piercing, their offer both tempting and terrifying. They had promised power, purpose, freedom from death itself. But they had also warned me that the pact would change the world in ways I couldn't foresee. Now, I was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about me. The relics, the marks, the trials, they were pieces of something far greater, far darker. The fate of the world wasn't just in my hands, it was bound to me, entwined with the pact and the power it granted. But that power came at a cost. The relics' light flickered faintly, their energy growing heavier. more volatile, as though responding to my thoughts. The marks on my skin burned hotter, their patterns shifting into shapes that seemed almost alive. I stopped in the middle of the street, my breathing shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The city around me was silent, its oppressive presence watching, waiting. And then, for the first time, the pack spoke. "The end is near," the voice said, low and resonant, its tone neither comforting nor threatening. "You must choose." "Choose what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Your path," the voice replied. "The power you wield will either save this world or destroy it." I stared at the relics in my hands, their light flickering in the gloom, and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on me. The fate of the world was in my hands, just as they had said. But what kind of world would I leave behind? The question lingered as I stood there, the city's darkness closing in around me, the relic's power pulsing in my veins, and the marks on my skin burning with the weight of the pact. Was I saving the world or destroying it? And was there ever truly a difference?